Welcome to today's DEFI program, Global Approaches to Educational Equity and Inclusion. My name is Kevin Martin. I'm the Center Manager for DEFI, which stands for the Digital Education Futures Initiative. Today's topic is of great personal interest to me, as among other things, I have 20 years experience working in sub-Saharan Africa, growing initiatives for expanding access to education. Work that became the basis of my own PhD thesis here at the Faculty of Education at Cambridge. DEFI was established 2 years ago, January 2021, as part of the bridge at Hughes Hall, Cambridge, to creatively explore the possibilities that digital technology opens for education, with a vision to create a more inclusive global education system. Today's hybrid webinar is our first of 2023, and I welcome you all. It is part of our new series, Digital and the Future of Dialogue, a theme we will carry throughout 2023. We are pleased to welcome more than 100 of you from around the globe to today's program. We also welcome our audience here in Cambridge. Thank you for taking the time to join us today in person. Many of you agreed to share your contact information with other registrants today. My colleague is placing a link in the chat right now so that you can view a list of the registrants. However, we seem to be having a slight problem with the chat feature in Zoom, which we are working to solve. If you are here in the room, we have a QR code at the sign-in desk in the back that you can also use to submit questions. And we hope that these questions will help to foster discussion and connections during and after today's event. The chat feature is also open for networking and open discussion if you would like to do so. Some of you have already started the conversation with fantastic questions submitted in advance, and we look forward to many more of you submitting questions during the session. Please use the Q&A button to submit your questions, and here in the room, you can join Zoom on your device to join the chat feature or use the QR code from the back. Look for the link to the Zoom room in the email that arrived in your inbox an hour ago. And if you do join Zoom from here in the room, please turn off your audio so that we don't get an echo effect. So I'm now going to briefly introduce our panelists. I will start to say that we are pleased to introduce and be joined by Dr. Farah Ahmed, the Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow here at the Faculty of Education in Cambridge. Dr. Farah is also a research fellow at Hughes Hall College and a co-convener for the Cambridge Educational Dialogue Research Group, or CEDAR. Her current project is Rethinking Islamic Education for British Muslim Children. We are also welcomed by Professor Bryan Maddox, who began working with DEFI in November 22 as Research Director of Digital Assessment Futures. Bryan is holistically exploring the ways in which digital technologies can help support new models of assessment in collaboration with industry partners. He is also a professor of educational assessment at the University of East Anglia, visiting professor at the Center for Educational Measurement, University of Oslo, and executive director of Assessment Microanalytics Limited. So thank you all. And with that, I invite Dr. Farah to begin her presentation.
Slides to come up. Okay, so thank you for attending. What I'll be talking about today is an online platform, and it's called the Islamic Educator Learning Community. And basically this platform came about, like many things, due to the pandemic, because when the pandemic hit, I realized I wasn't going to be able to collect my data for my postdoc study. So how was I going to go about doing that? So then I sort of transformed my project a little bit and decided that I would do this online. So do you just move the slide? Okay, so it's a new learning community of Islamic educators. So we've used the term education because we don't want it to be just formal teachers. And we're doing this with anybody who's working with children aged 3 to 18 years. That includes homeschoolers. And so I can't make it go away. Right, so essentially, the Islamic Educator Learning Community is an online research exchange platform housed within CAMTRE, which is the Cambridge Teacher Research Exchange, which is part of DEFI, right? So it's nested within this wider kind of ecosystem of digital education futures. And it's designed to facilitate exchange between Islamic scholarship, educational research, and Islamic schools and educators, including informal educators, to bring them together and to have an engagement. And we support teachers and educators to engage in reflective practice, conduct their own classroom research inquiries in order to improve learning. And then educators are then encouraged to share their inquiries via the CAMTRE library. I want to sort of talk very briefly about the kind of context within which this is emerging. So the best way to sort of approach that is that this community is centering around, or the things that are bringing it together are essentially a decolonial project, in the sense that in Muslim contexts, you have this bifurcated educational systems, where you have these national systems of education set up by post-colonial states. At the end of empires, you then have these nation states, and they create these systems which are trying to modernize, and modernize in the sense of modernity as understood by that perspective. But they are very nation-centric. And yet you still have the remnants of, or the revitalization or the renewal of traditional forms of education, which most Muslim children will attend in some capacity, which are running in parallel alongside this. So for example, in the UK Muslim context, most Muslim kids, and roughly about 8 to 10% of UK school children are of Muslim heritage. So it's quite a large number. They are going to mosque schools, madrasas, in the evenings and weekends, pretty much a lot of the time. So they're having these two forms of education, and this is happening across the world. Now, one of the things is that this is not great for children for many reasons, and people have been talking for a long time about, okay, how do we address this? What are the practical things that schools can do this when the educators work in these informal spaces, technically informal, or the schooling systems or the private education? How can we address this? So the idea of this community, that's why you're bringing together Islamic educational theory, contemporary educational research, and people on the ground. Right? So it's quite a big kind of wider project that context is important. So we're going to, the idea is to contribute to a growing knowledge base of pedagogical innovations born from Islamic education theory and values, and eventually inform policy and practice to improve learning for all, especially the most vulnerable and disadvantaged. One of the ways that the UN Millennium Goals for having literacy, meeting literacy targets for young children, was to actually leverage the Quran schools in places like sub-Saharan Africa and places like that, because it at least allowed children who were not attending a mainstream school or a state school to become literate. And that this is where there's those kinds of literacy was traditionally taught in those settings in any case. So the point at hand is that you're working at the nexus of a lot of different issues. But the idea for this platform is that this is a decolonial project in the sense that it is drawing from the complex and varied cultural and indigenous and religious traditions of the communities that we're working with. So it's a growing global community of active educators and school leaders sharing their classroom research to improve Islamic education curricula, pedagogy and practices. And when we say Islamic education, it doesn't mean just to teach Islam. It means things like science within Muslim contexts. So what services are we offering? Apologies, the slides seem to be formatted not the way they should be. What we've been doing is running free 6-week asynchronous online open access sustainable courses. So we run one called Dialogue in Islamic Education using halakha, which is a very traditional form of education, develop shakhsiyah, which could be understood as identity, personhood, character. And we're developing further courses on Islam, science and education, trying to deal with some of the controversial controversies that arise in Muslim contexts to do with science, and also art and design, drawing from Islamic tradition, culture, and heritage, because art and craft used to be a very important part of Islamic educational practices, but they have become increasingly marginalized and very, certainly in the state system, that's not funded or supported the way it should be. And we're supporting the people who come onto the course to initially either do a reflective inquiry or a kind of a classroom inquiry, drawing on some specific research methodologies, depending what they feel comfortable doing, and then sharing resources. So what we've done is we integrated educational dialogue research and EdTech to enhance the practice across these international contexts. We're interested in what capacity is there for practitioner and professional development through asynchronous dialogue across the global north and south. So the courses have a wide range of cohorts, and although there are some live sessions, they're not compulsory. So the main forum for dialogue between the participants is a discussion forum, which actually has been working better than expected. And then other questions, what are the affordances and limitations of these mechanical MOOCs, i.e. asynchronous, in accessing hard to reach practitioner communities in low-income countries? And what's the role of dialogue in youth development and so on? We've had over 550 teachers sign up to the platform. And 200 of these completed the optional pre-course survey for the first run of the course, which was in April to June last year. Over 50 completed the 1,000-word reflective inquiry report, which was required to get a certificate of attendance. But the requirement was that to get the certificate, but people may well have completed it and not submitted the report. People may have completed the course. I've heard a lot of people say, well, I've done it, but I couldn't be bothered to write the report up because I'm not that bothered about getting a certificate. But nevertheless, it's not a bad number from starting off with about 200. We've conducted a pre and post course survey. Focus group feedback is currently being analysed, and a second course is being devised and will be taught from next week. Okay, so the preliminary findings: participants appreciated the course content because they commented that it helped them think about traditional forms of learning, and people were sort of like, well, I never thought about that being something that as a school teacher I should think about, although I know it happens, like people just see it as a parallel thing, even though in your education, that's that education over there, this is this education over here. Why is that happening? How can we kind of address that? And that was something that people felt that they did appreciate that. They also appreciated how to become more dialogic in their practice, help them gain a deeper understanding of human, person, character, education. 55% of participants said that the tools impacted their practice a lot, and 30% said a moderate amount, which is 85% of saying that there was impact, and 11% said a limited amount, demonstrating that the vast majority said that there was impact. Participants found the live sessions important. I can't see the slide, but I'm pretty certain it says on there something about the discussion forum actually being a tool that a lot of them used. Not everybody, but they found that was useful to share ideas with. So they had prompts every week. They had key questions, and they could choose which one that they responded to. And then another criteria for getting a certificate was they had to post one response to the question and post a response to a colleague. The biggest barrier in terms of challenges was 59% said that course completion, the biggest barrier to them completing the course was other personal and professional responsibilities. So it's the same thing that we find anywhere teachers are poor on time, and therefore it becomes challenging. The course commitment was about 2 to 3 hours a week, which is quite a lot over a 6-week period. 39% found the readings overly challenging, which is interesting and useful because then we can improve that. 7% found the activities overly challenging. 11% reported low bandwidth as a barrier, which is quite a low number considering, and only 2% reported lack of a device or equipment as a barrier. We asked quite a lot of questions about how much technology they have access to, how much their schools have access to. I didn't want to do all of that, but the bandwidth, and it's fairly low but then that may well be because we're accessing people who have access to technology, right? We are developing research partnerships, actively exploring partnerships with Global Association of Islamic Schools, Manzil Education, which is an NGO that works with street kids in Pakistan. And within Nigeria, there's 3 different organizations. There's Ryan Academy, New Horizons School, and one of the federal universities who have all interested in becoming facilitators and to take the platform forward, as well as other countries. And we're also working with the Centre of Zone Thought and Education at the University of South Australia. So that's about it. I'll stop there and we'll take questions later on.
Thank you, Dr. Farah. And now I invite Professor Bryan Maddox up for his presentation. Thank you.
Can I come here so I can see the screen? Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Wonderful. Thanks so much for the invitation to talk. So my topic is a bit different, and it seems a shame to move on so rapidly onto a different context. But I'm sure in the questions we'll be able to return, and I'll also try and make some possible links as well, potentially between the presentations. So in my presentation, I'm going to be looking at equitable and inclusive digital educational assessments. And in fact, a lot of my work on educational assessment started in Islamic South Asian context, although I'm not going to really talk about them today, but I found the initial presentation really stimulating. So in preparation for my presentation today, Dr. Fawaz at DEFI asked me a very straightforward question, which was he was asking me about the timescales. When I was thinking about digital education futures, what kind of timescales was I thinking about? And I said, well, it's a very good question, but I don't know the answer. And then I went off puzzling about it. And I realized afterwards that having an anthropological training, we tend to look at things in terms of the present day and in terms of the past, but rarely in terms of the future. And so it became a puzzle for me about how to manage this. And so what I want to do today is to talk about the changes that are taking place in educational assessment, particularly in standardized large-scale assessments and examinations, and the kind of dynamics that are happening in that area. Now, I want to just start with a bit of anthropological distancing, which is actually I was reflecting on my own experience and how I might bring that experience to thinking about futures, digital education futures. And so this image, to start off with, is from my early PhD research in Bangladesh. And I was working with rural farming and fishing communities in the northwest of Bangladesh. And I realized actually what I was observing was technology change. So these photographs that you can see now were taken around 1999, 2000. And what they show is the way that these farming and fishing communities are using literacy as a form of technology to manage their business and accounting practices, particularly around fishing and farming. And so in the image, you can see, in this case, a young boy who's been taken out of school to help the adults in the market, and he's operating as a scribe with his notepad there. And then in the slightly faded picture there, you can see is the technology of the day, which was to write accounts on the back of cigarette packets. And the reason why people wrote them on the back of cigarette packets is cigarette packets have got a plastic waterproof film on them, and so they don't get soggy. And if you happen to be a fisherman, your account not being soggy was actually, it's quite a good affordance, a good material affordance. Now, what I wanted to show you with that was as a bit of anthropological distancing, to explore affordances of different material artifacts and ways of operating. But also to note one thing, which was that when I went back to the same area in 2005, so barely 5 years later, these same communities had transitioned from using pen and paper to using mobile phones to do similar things. Sorry, Farah, you okay? Okay, so I'll carry on. Thank you. So they were all using it. So in a very, very short time, they had made this transition, which to digital phones. And the farming and fishing communities had actually learned, these texts in this image here are in Bengali, but because the initial first wave of digital technologies, digital phone technologies, mobile phone technologies in that area, it was very difficult to use Bengali script. So those farming and fishing communities had actually learned Roman script. So these are, in many cases, people who have very low levels of literacy, and who had literacy in the Bengali script language, and who very, very rapidly learned the Roman script for using on their mobile phones. Now, I'm hoping that they now would be using Bengali script, and that the technology would have caught up. But what I wanted to reflect on very briefly is that I doubt whether any of those people, and certainly I didn't expect that rapid change, and the way that technology would drive change in that community. There were no mobile phones in that community back in 1999. By 2005, everybody had mobile phones. And everybody's integrated those mobile phones into their communicative practices around accounting, communication, business, and various other activities as well, including some Islamic networks and education and so on. So I think I wanted to reflect on that very often when there is technological change, we can look back and we can look at what's going on in the present, like I had done, but it's very hard to look very far into the future. Now, when we come to digital assessments, what we've got going on at the moment is a very rapid process of change. In many ways, I think anybody working in the assessment field right now probably feels that that's a process of change which is happening too fast. That's one problem. And it's been driven by technology change. So the new technology is bringing new affordances, and it's been taken up in education in ways that people not only hadn't anticipated, but have to then deal with. And we can think of ChatGPT as an example of really rapid change that's happening. So what I want to do now is to consider that and consider what it means for planned and unplanned processes of change in assessment, and in particular what it means for equity and inclusion. And I'm going to focus in particular on inclusive assessment. I'm going to focus on the UK, but I know that many colleagues I work with are working all over the world on very, very similar issues and in very similar sort of timescales. It's not like the UK is ahead or behind. It's all happening at a very sort of global level. So in the UK context, then, in the last year, there was a UK government green paper around special education needs and disabilities and young people, and that was I found it really compelling reading. One thing it says is that over 15% of all school pupils, so 1.4 million in England, are identified with special education needs. So it's a really very large group, but still very much a minority in a statistical sense. And then the other things that they were saying was that children and young people would then have consistently worse outcomes than their peers across every measure. And just 22% reached the expected standard in reading, writing, and maths. So what you've got there is a large group, and a group that have got marked disadvantage. And that disadvantage comes across the board in education and in educational assessment, there's a well-established set of accommodations which try to reduce those disadvantages when it comes to assessment. But technology is impacting. Barry, just let you know the camera's frozen. So technology is impacting quite rapidly in that area. Talk a little bit about that. Okay, great. Okay, so a little bit then about inclusive assessment. I want to just tease out one or two key kind of themes that I think are significant. The first one is around standardization. So inclusive assessment, one of the things that it tries to do is embrace diversity. And it sort of recognizes from the outset that communities, students, pupils are very diverse in a number of ways. And in a broad sense, inclusive education tries to accept, recognize, and embrace that diversity as a feature of education. And so you want to be adapting the education practices and institutions to that diversity rather than the other way around. When it comes to assessment, it's a bit tricky. And one of the reasons is that, as Steve Ceresi has pointed out, that standardization is often thought of as the hallmark of assessment fairness and quality and validity. Historically, so we're looking back now, that's how it's been established. Standardization has been this key aim to establish validity, fairness, etc. And what Steve Ceresi argues is that as we begin to recognize diversity, for example, around SEND conditions, we have to really rethink that. And he points out that a lot of the theory around standardization in education assessment came from a period of time when there wasn't as much recognition of diversity, there wasn't as much recognition of disability as there is now. We somehow have to realign those things. And as far as Steve Ceresi is concerned, and I would agree, it's a move away from standardization to more kind of dynamic forms of accommodation that recognize and respond to difference in a very proactive way. So then where is this going then in terms of digital assessment futures? And I know that many people who are joining the webinar today will have lots of questions, lots of comments, lots of views about this. But I wanted just to tease out some of them. The first point I want to make is I think we need to move away from mode equivalence to consider technological affordances. Technology change, one of the things it does is it creates continuities with the past, but also ruptures, as we move away from old practice. And one of the things that people were very concerned about with the rise of digital assessments was, can we establish the equivalence with paper-based assessments? Now, I think that while we might want to do that when we have multiple modes of assessment going on in the context, we want to establish some comparability, and we want to establish whether it's valid to compare across modes. We're not really talking about equivalence, because the whole thing about digital assessments is they have lots of new affordances which are radically different from pen and paper. And we need to embrace that, and we need to think about where it might take us. And I want to just to give one or two examples of that. So the first one is about adaptive and inclusive technologies. Digital assessments now have access to a whole range of inclusive adaptations that enable them to be more accessible for people with special education needs and disabilities. Now, that can be things like online tools such as online readers, spell checkers, other accommodations like being able to increase the size of screens, read text out, etc. And all those technologies are extremely important. But actually, and it comes back to Dr. Fawaz's comment, when we start thinking about that, that's already here. That's in the present. But what about futures? Where's that taking us? And I think the pace of change, as we're probably all aware in the last few weeks, is lots of stuff in the media about the way that these things are impacting on education and assessment. The pace of change is extremely rapid. Now, it seems to me, looking just a little bit into the future, what we're going to be able to do is some more radical stuff. So, for example, we already have computer adaptive assessments, which emphasize the importance of item fit, so delivering assessment content to match the abilities of the student. And so that's already moving very fast. And that's very helpful, because one of the things it does is it prevents a situation that we have in standardization where people are delivered the wrong content. In other words, they have content which is too easy or too difficult, and that causes all sorts of disruptions in the assessment experience. But perhaps we can go further. For example, might those forms of responsive, adaptive systems actually have other roles? For example, to help people to feel more, to have a more pleasant, happy experience of assessment, to reduce stress, for example. Might a computer-based system alter the content, alter the way it's presented in order to help to be in a responsive way, to help somebody who's dealing with stress and anxiety? Going further, perhaps one of the things we can do is move away from, with special education needs and disabilities, the very heavy admin burden of diagnosis, which is a huge barrier to many students. And perhaps we can have systems which either build in inclusion tools so that the people don't need to have those initial diagnoses, or systems which are actually sufficiently personalized and responsive to do their own diagnosis. So you might have an assessment which has a built-in diagnostic process, where people are actually, where the machines are able to identify features of, let's say, incompatibility with content, etc., with design, and actually match the design and the presentation to the individual. And I think, it won't be too long, I think, before that's the present, not just the future in assessment. And so what it requires is some really radical thought, I think, about the nature of inclusion and inclusive assessment. But I think in terms of affordances, it offers an awful lot of potential. The big challenge for anyone working in the assessment field is managing that process. So, when I talk with colleagues in assessment organizations, they're all starting to think about timescales. What are we dealing with now? What are we dealing with in 2 years' time? What are we dealing with in 5 years' time? And with the nature of change and the pace of change, we can see a little bit into the future, but we can't see very far into the future. But like those farmers and fishermen that I was presenting at the beginning, within 1 or 2 years, we might be dealing with forms of assessment products, dynamic assessments, interactive assessments that we just had never anticipated. Now, I hope that when we do that, we can anticipate and build in the needs of children with special education needs and disabilities. And I think if we can do that in a way which prioritizes those children as children who have particular needs, then I think it will probably benefit all learners. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Bryan.
Other slides? So you may have noticed that we originally had a third panelist who unfortunately was unable to join us today at the last minute. But we have a surprise speaker for you to cover a somewhat related topic. And that surprise speaker will be myself. But I will be able to talk to you for a few minutes about some ongoing research that I am doing in sub-Saharan Africa in rural farming communities, in the way that technology is being used and in combination with dialogue to overcome gaps in the digital divide. So there you go. My name is Kevin. So this project has identified a gap that many of you are probably very well aware of. that typical learning with mobile approaches that operate in the global south face a range of problems that are not easily overcome. So traditionally, these systems focus on the capabilities of the technology and not on the available affordances. Many existing learning management systems are very much derivatives of formal classroom environments like this and don't work well in environments where much of the education happens in non-formal dialogic small groups like you find across rural East Africa. They also don't adequately account for the pedagogical needs of the learners who are accustomed to that form of dialogue and interacting with their peers within a small group. And so the challenge that this particular research project was trying to address was this confluence of ways that technology is not working well in these rural environments, and to see if through a human-centered approach that was driving down to what the most common affordances were, a system could be developed that used technology to overcome those gaps. So to summarize, looking at this misalignment between indigenous pedagogy, mobile pedagogy, and technological affordances, and finding a solution that operated within that space that could overcome those gaps in the digital divide. That divide, as many of you know, colleague Katie here at the EdTech Hub is very well aware of the fact that things like mobile usage habits or handset access or network access further compound the challenges being faced in many of these rural communities. So that was something that had to be accounted for in taking this project forward. So working with a group of subsistence farmers across central Kenya and western Uganda, began to, in a co-development process, build a learning management system based on a mobile phone platform. So you can see here represented the communities that were participating in the design of this platform. This is all situated around the Mount Kenya region here in central Kenya, and then you can see off the side a bit in western Uganda. I did this in partnership with the International Small Group and Tree Planting Program, or TIST. TIST is a leading afforestation and carbon sequestration organization. It is farmer-led, with over 140,000 subsistence farmers participating across Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and India. It is comprised of 97% of subsistence farmers, and participation rates are 52-48 male-female. So is very representative of the general population and a bit of an anomaly for approaches like this, which tend to be weighted more heavily with male participation. So working with these farmers, identified 4 dominant themes that were creating the foundation of the challenges being faced on the use of educational technology in rural environments. And we categorize this into, first, basic technological access. So your access to hardware or to a SIM card. The second category identified was advanced technological access, which we characterize as how well you were able to connect to the local network, what connection speeds you had, and if you were able to engage with internet. Third was the amount of digital consumption that you as an individual were able to engage. So as many of you know, using digital data in these environments requires a pay-as-you-go system. And so there is a lot of monitoring of how much data is being used in these rural environments. And oftentimes you might only, say in Kenya, be able to purchase a 200 shilling data card that might only give you maybe 3 or 4 minutes of internet access or 30 text messages. And so understanding the rate of digital consumption was important to design a learning management system that was able to operate within those confines. Say, supply an entire learning module that would only use a 200 shilling data card in order to download to a phone. And then the fourth was effort required to access the network, found through the surveys deployed to rural farmers that on average, about 60% had to walk 3 kilometers from their village house in order to access a reliable network. So while they might have some access from their home, in order to actually send and receive data, it often required, say, a walk to a hill outside the village. So using that knowledge and then documenting common affordances being used throughout the community, one of which I'd like to highlight here, which is the affordance known as side loading. So side loading is the passing of information between either a Bluetooth connection or downloaded to a micro SD card used on an Android phone. So documented these affordances to see what solution could be developed that would be able to overcome those challenges that I just identified. But the side loading affordance ended up being key to making the entire mobile education model work. It's also important to document the role that dialogue has in these rural communities. So the farmers that I had the pleasure of working with have a shared value system that supports dialogue within their groups. So each of these farmers is part of a group of 6 to 12 other farmers who meet regularly. And over 20 years of working together, they've developed a set of ground rules for dialogue. And I've summarized them here in small group composition. These farmer groups are required to have members from at least 3 families and to be 50-50 male-female participation. The global and local dialogue, meaning they have access to some outside resources that incite dialogue within the small group. So whether it be local newspapers or the TIST newsletter or a visitor from another village coming and giving a demonstration, it's all very important to helping dialogue foster within the groups. They have a shared system of roles within the groups where there is rotating leadership. So each time a group meets, there's a new leader. And then they also have a co-leader who helps to keep track of time. And then they all agree on a system of servant leadership that in participating in dialogue, their role is to foster dialogue, not to dominate conversation. And then there is a unique pedagogical practice called kujingama, which means to build up in Swahili. But at the end of every small group meeting, they take time to affirm one another and the role that they had in supporting the group. And this is often focused on the leader. So looking at those, the Dialogic Foundation, in conjunction with the common affordances and the challenges, built both a pedagogy and a platform that could operate within these confines. So I will wrap up quickly here. The system that was developed is now called the TIST Learning Center. It was deployed about 2 years ago. It is being used by about 5,000 farmers across Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, and just starting to grow in India. But you can see some pictures here of the platform being used. And what's happening here is you have this woman who's accessing through her device, but now she's able to pull the information on the Learning Center onto a micro SD card and pass it to her friends. And that then allows her to act as a hub for access to all of this information. And then that's used to start dialogue within the small group. And the curricula itself is centered around supporting those dialogic ground rules that I covered earlier, so that it's reinforcing the way that dialogue happens within these communities. I have another set of pictures here, I believe. No, I don't, sorry. So major features of this platform include oral content delivery. So everything is available through audio in both English and Swahili, with the recordings done in local dialects. The content is also provided in English and Swahili. It's downloadable through this side loading feature that we talked about, so it's optimized to handle that. It's shareable without an internet connection. All of the content worked very hard to make it what I call bite-sized, as small as possible in terms of bytes. So each training has on the homepage, it will list how many megabytes are required in order to access this information, providing the learner's agency to decide whether they would like to engage with the content. There's a video library of peer demonstration videos. As I mentioned, it has prompts to support Kujingana and the small group foundation rules. And currently, it is now integrated with WhatsApp. So we have an ongoing project with Meta that has created a WhatsApp EduBot to act as the forward-facing interface for this learning platform. I think something that's very important to note is instead of introducing a new technology or platform in these environments, it's important to leverage what's already being used. And that's where WhatsApp comes in. We might all have reservations with Meta, but WhatsApp is the most common social media platform used in sub-Saharan Africa. And so having a WhatsApp-facing interface has really helped to expand access to the content. Also something to note, you do not need an email address or credit card or any other sort of identification to access the learning content, which you would maybe not be surprised at how many barriers to entry there are for free learning content in many similar platforms. But we've removed all of those barriers and allowed this to now be open access for anyone who wishes to engage with the learning content. And you can see some images here of the content. This is the audio bar at top so that you can listen. This is an example of a local tribal dialect that the content is currently being translated into. These are some of the demonstration videos that are shared. They get shared through WhatsApp and then curated and put into the learning platform, and then further trainings are built around these demonstration videos. So what's emerged from this is an idea of a hub model, where to expand access to the learning content, we are basing it on the idea that often you might only have one person in the community who has the access to the hardware, to the economic resources, and the technological infrastructure to access the learning content. So we're optimizing all content to be pulled down to this hub and then shared with other community members. And we're currently in development of expanding the learning center so that the entire app can be sideloaded to other members. And then when they next connect to the network, we can pull information on usage data and assessments when they connect. So fortunate to have Wells Fargo currently supporting a project to expand access to the learning center through those means. The most important implications I've found for this research project have been that the adoption of indigenous approaches to dialogue can be a tool for overcoming some of the most pernicious challenges in the digital divide. Instead of relying on the technology, we rely on the way that people are interacting and working with each other in the community and finding ways to adapt to that scenario rather than push more technology as the solution. And then next steps, I did mention we have this WhatsApp EduBot. It was officially launched last week with a soft launch. So we're just going through final testing of it right now. It is available both in English and Swahili. We are expanding access through design principles identified through this research project that Wells Fargo is supporting, and then looking at even greater expansion of possibilities for how this confluence of dialogue and technology can be used in these environments to expand access. So I will say thank you, and then we can move on to questions. All right, so Barry, I think I'll move the camera here. So the first question I have for our panelists, two of you, what lessons have you learned from your respective projects and research that you think are essential for other practitioners and researchers to understand? Have say, a top 2 lessons learned that you want to make sure the community is problematic.
Okay. Well, it's a tough question. I think in the assessment world, it's about managing change. And the fact that technological enhanced change means doing things sometimes quite different. I mean, your presentation is talking about continuities and building on existing practices, and I think that's fine, but occasionally you just have really significant change that requires new ways of thinking about things, new ways of doing things. And the assessment work, absolutely one of the major changes is the importance of user experience. So moving from paper to digital means a lot more work looking at digital interfaces and how to interact with them. So it's meant the whole new area around the test taker experience and user experience that's had to be developed, which means new areas of specialism, new budget lines, new ways of working, new protocols. And so that's interesting to me because 10 years ago, no one even thought about user experience in assessment, and now it's very much core to having to think about it. So that's really disruptive change, causing us to have to think really differently about things. And beyond that, things like interface design. These were not challenges that people had 5-10 years ago. Now every assessment organization is having to puzzle over really good, accessible interface design. So I think that process of technologically driven change is partly about accepting that there will be new ways of thinking about things, new ways of doing things, which didn't exist because of changing affordances and changing technological demands. And so it's really a big challenge of change management. And I'm really interested by the fact that often we get these sort of community-based processes of change, which appear to be very seamless and organic, and yet a lot of organizations have been facing very, very significant challenges. And in some ways, in the worst situation, if organizations can't change, for example, if we can't go digital, we can't do it well enough, then their products and services may no longer be desired by the users.
It's a very difficult question, actually, because what do you prioritize and what claims do you make that you've discovered something which is going to apply to everybody? For me, I think both of you mentioned communities who instinctively begin to use technology in specific ways, right? And I think that itself is something there that does need further thinking about, because each of those communities, I imagine, I'm not sure, but if you go from fishing village to fishing village or different villages, there would be differences in exactly how that is operating. And I think that's something that what I've learned is to empower the people that you're working with, have the agency, feel that they can do what they need to do with either the technology or the tools or the learning and apply it as they see fit. And sort of tied in with that, one thing that I've always thought about and probably used to test it with that, it's not so much about the technology, but it's to do with it's other types of, I suppose, attitudes, values, and skills, so that you can have people working with old-fashioned technology who won't use it, who won't look for a way to use it better or a way to make it more streamlined or effective or just a bit more useful. And those same people would do that if you gave them different types of technology. So sometimes it's more to do with those kind of attitudes or soft skills, which are much less tangible and harder to work with. But one thing that I try and do is build that into the way, the ethos of any program is that to empower people and make them feel that this is about them and their needs. So it's trying to connect those two things together so that they feel that they can make those changes and it enables them to do that. And the challenge that I think it's great to hear that you were doing translation into a localized language. I think language is one of the biggest challenges in EdTech. And I think it's a bit of an elephant in the room that we don't really want to think too much about. So it's amazing that you were doing that. I think that that's something that perhaps needs to be prioritized. We need to think about putting resources into that because as much as you can Romanize different languages, and a lot of people use the Romanized alphabet to communicate via WhatsApp, or do it in all sorts of other languages. As much as you can do that, there are people who don't have access even to that you're not able to. I think that's a big question. Also, it's just it's about an issue of ethics and values, is that languages are dying out because of the sort of normalization of English, normalization of whatever languages use. So that I think is something that needs, I suppose, to me, one of the biggest challenges.
Thank you. Our next question is for Bryan. So may I ask, apart from adjusting the delivery of assessment to meet special education needs students, are there other ways to adapt to their needs? For example, content design.
Yeah, it's a nice question. There's a lot of work going on at the moment about using AI to create content. And I think it's probably just the beginning of that. And my sense is probably that, as we move forward, there'll be systems that are creating content all the time. And it may be that the content is actually different between students. And I think so that's an ambitious change, but I think it's it's extremely likely. Farah's point about language I think also is similar. It might well be that a computer-based system can deliver in any language that you want, and that we can move between languages. And it may be that, for example, there will be assessments where you might have either avatars who are interacting in different languages with the participant, or facilitating discussions with other students and assessing in that kind of way. So I'm not sure it quite answers the question. I do think there's also there's a sort of interesting interface between digital affordances and content. And so some of the digital assessments that I've seen recently have been taking advantage of digital affordances. For example, with the use of 3D shapes, or how people interact with visualizations of materials that you couldn't do on paper. I think that's probably going to, those kind of interactive forms of content are probably going to be increasing from the slightly clunky interactive approaches that we have at the moment. We have like fixed responses to much more fluid interactive content. Yeah, that's good.
Next question is for you, Prof. So you mentioned the need to decolonize education and education. What role does dialogue play in this issue? And how is technology supporting or hindering that process?
Well, on a more simple level, any kind of education needs dialogue. You need to have different ideas and intention to start thinking about things. And decolonization obviously is it can mean anything to anything, right? What does it even mean? And then that's a big question in itself. In the context that I'm trying to use that term or working within, is to do with an educational model that was very much about the human person understanding their ontological being in a spiritual way to leverage knowledge for personal change that was within the community framework. So it's not just an individual change. And that relied upon a very strong teacher-learner relationship to be there. And it also relied upon the traditional practices of sensibility to raise a child. It also relied upon a lot of informal education happening, as we see in the other examples that I was in the presentations. An ongoing sort of ethos of education. Frank Rosenthal, Oriental scholar, titles his book Knowledge Triumphant, and he teaches that the argument is that the Islamic world, probably a better way of using it, so which is a large part of the globe, very, very vastly different cultures, but all drawing heavily from an Islamic worldview, was very much characterized by knowledge. That knowledge is the defining feature of that civilization, which is really, really interesting because it was pre-modern and education wasn't institutionalized. So there's a lot of history here. So George Muntisy has written about how the divergence that happens with the higher education institutions in Europe becoming more and more controlled by the state over time, even in the pre-modern era, and how certain mechanisms within the Islamic world of the autonomy of the scholars of the ulama, people who had knowledge, prevented that kind of standardization, although you did have institutionalization happening to some degree, but there's divergences within it. So I guess where I'm coming from, like dialogue is a word that can be anything, but for the kind of work that I'm trying to do is to take those ways of thinking about education to forward. What can we do? And into a classroom context, and to the teachers are engaging with these kinds of ideas, and then think about what that means for them in practice. It's just, you get these little shifts in what teachers are doing in the classroom and how they're thinking about what they're doing with their children. So it's a very kind of loose, no answer to your question perhaps, but in some sense, that's the space within which I'm working to try and explain it a little bit further. That answer the question, I'm not sure it does.
It does. Makes us think about it more explain. Bryan, I was wondering if you might have thoughts to share on this role in colonizing assessment.
It's a very, very nice question, but I would have to go and think about that for some time.
So we have another question here from our audience. So this is one for you, Bryan. So I have a feeling that apart from the preliminary remarks about Bangladesh, your words could have been quoted from Skinner in the 50s. So I recognize that the implications are very different because of the changes to technology. At least the thinking, not very soon.
It's the first time my work has been in any way connected with Skinner. It surprises me, and I can't quite get it. But I think probably somebody who's more familiar with Skinner to see the connections. And for me, one of the reasons why that surprises me is that I feel like the ecology of assessment situations are really, really important. And that ecology is what partly shapes practices. So I can understand where the question would come from. And I think perhaps it's about the extent to which we might think technology is driving people in a particular direction, driving behavioral change in a particular direction. And I think that's really interesting. Certainly in terms of the philosophy of technology, from people like Heidegger and so on, that would be concerned that technology might be pushing civilization, pushing people in particular directions, and potentially directions which they don't feel as close to their sense of humanity. I don't feel like that. And I feel like that really one of the key things that's driving change, and I perhaps didn't have time to talk about it as much as I would like to, is the role of values, the role of educational values. And I think those are actually central. So I didn't have much time to talk about it in the presentation, but I think for any organization that's, for example, embracing technology, new forms of digital technology in education more generally and in assessment, one of the core things that drives those decisions is educational values. In other words, where do we want to be going with this technology? And I think that's what's particularly exciting, I think, for the opportunities that technology change creates around the affordances is the opportunity to reflect on practice and to reflect on our values and say, well, what would be the kind of change that we would think would be progressive and positive. So I hope, and I feel that probably distances me scared. So let me see what we do.
Well, we are about out of time, so I have one last question for you that should be an easy one, and then we can wrap up. But given that we are at the very beginning, and this is the first DEFI webinar of the year, what most excites you about your research over the coming year?
So I suppose I'm excited to be working with teachers again from next week onwards and to see, well, we're running the second follow-up course, so I've been very excited to see how teachers now take what they're learning in the first course further and what happens from passing to the ground and looking at what the reflective or the inquiry reports show. The other thing I'm quite excited about is we're doing the conference in June on staff science and education, which already has created a bit of controversy, and I've had several emails and things about people saying that about that. So this seems to be another area that I'm not that familiar with, which isn't really EdTech as such, but it's something that is related in the sense that trying to address issues that teachers are facing around, and this seems to be a huge topic. But that's quite exciting for me. I'm not sure whether that relates to economics.
Yeah, I hope that it's going to be an exciting year in the assessment environment. There's a few things that I think might happen, and I'm excited about. One is, I hope, based on my interest in inclusive assessment, that in the coming year will bring a lot of change in terms of more inclusive, more equitable assessments, and that actually might impact on education in really, really profound ways, and make us think differently about inclusion, and make us think differently about equity and the outcomes, particularly for students with special education disabilities. As I said at the beginning, I think that mode equivalence is not the main issue. The main issue is how technology change might create new affordances that makes education and assessment more equitable. So I think I'm hoping for that, and I'm hoping that that will work through different assessment practices and regulatory frameworks. Big things, for example, building in built-in audio players into all assessments. This is profoundly valuable for many students who've got special education disabilities. If that's happening by the end of 2023, I'll be really delighted. And beyond that, unexpectedly brilliant things that I think might happen, things that we just don't anticipate, that are just fantastic. We look back and think, wow, we didn't expect that, and it's great. So I think it's quite exciting.
Well, thank you both for joining us today, and thank you to our online audience and our in-person audience. If you want to continue the conversation, please join our mailing list. Otherwise, let's give a round of applause for our panelists, and feel free, if you're here in the room, to stick around and talk with each other.